It's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Jaime Saavedra. I'm a Global Director for Education at the World Bank. And we're here, again, to continue discussing, talking and about the importance of the role of teachers in the education process. Here we're going to share about what the World Bank has been doing, but more important than that, to reflect about the importance of the profession. Many of you who might have heard me before, and I'm convinced that successful school systems basically depend on the quality of teachers, and that also is extremely closely related to how much the teacher profession is valued in a society. So, it is absolutely essential that, there is a social recognition of the incredibly important role that teachers play, right, in the education of our children, our young people, and in that regard, the essential role that they play in the development of a country. So that's from a more macro perspective, and from the perspective of a child, right? Too many students across the world are still sitting in classrooms that are not necessary, with teachers that aren't necessarily as effective as they should be. Many others are lucky, right, and have a fantastic teacher, a teacher that inspires them, a teacher that instills creativity, a teacher that instills teamwork, a teacher that says things that can change the life of a young boy or a young girl. Unfortunately, that's not happening in all the classrooms. And teachers are so important in the development of societies and in the development of the life and in the life of a child, that we cannot really afford that not every child, every young boy and girl are working and interacting with a great teacher. We had a huge learning crisis before this pandemic. We were already saying that had a learning crisis. The figure that we were using is that 53% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries could not read and understand a simple text. That's what we call learning poverty. And 53% is the dramatically high number, right? It's more than half of children, even if they are going to school, right, do not have the fundamental skills. And we expect that number will grow, unfortunately, as a consequence of the lockdowns and the pandemics and the huge and extensive closures of schools that we have lived during the whole 2020, and we're still living in many countries during 2021. So if we had a challenge before, now the challenge is even more important, and the crisis that we had is even more dramatic. So we really need to step up our game. This extraordinary nature of the challenge calls for an equally powerful response. Before the pandemic, in 2019, the World Bank launched what we call as the Global Platform for Successful Teachers to help countries enhance their teachers' policies to improve teaching and learning. This global platform, on one hand, provides financing, but on the other critical point is that provides different aspects related to technical support that can help governments to shape a better teacher's career. We are now we have a critical challenge to continue that support to countries and to continue the support to the work that each teacher is doing in each school, in each classroom. Each one of them has faced a very complex situation during the last year, and many of them have done a huge effort in order to support and continue working with their children. But let's hear from teachers telling us the unique challenge that they are facing today.
Hello, my name is Cindy Bernal. A greeting to everyone from Colombia.
Hi, I am Vinita Girl from India.
I am Olasukomi Okoifa, a teacher in Nigeria.
Eu me chamo Francisco Celso e sou professor de História da Unidade de Internação de Santa Maria.
Hi, my name is Mike Dunley and I teach 3rd grade in Southern New Jersey.
My name is Muhammad Muhtadi Muhammad. I am teacher for United Arab Emirates. I am teacher for special needs education.
I'm Przemek, and I am a teacher from Poland.
My name is Scott Hebert from Alberta, Canada.
This has been the most challenging year of my 18-year career of teaching.
With challenges such as engaging and meeting the needs of diverse range of learners.
E o maior desafio nessa pandemia está sendo cuidar da saúde emocional dos meus alunos.
Talk of inadequate manpower, lack of motivation, class congestion.
Teaching during this global pandemic has shown the world the inequalities that exist in every public education system around this world.
And what we've discovered is that it has never been more important than to make sure that all of our students' needs are being met. We've had to address their social and emotional needs and even their families' needs before we can begin to tackle the academic.
Teacher's mission is to awaken his or her students' desire to learn.
I use COVID-19 pandemic to create an opportunity to teach life skills to my students. Learn how to deal effectively with demands and challenges of everyday's life and exemplify to students that tools beyond academics are vital to lead a fulfilling life.
We have managed to develop strategies that resume participation through other media such as radio, newspaper, and television.
We also have to encourage governments to promote connectivity for teachers and students.
The solution lies in our willpower and the use of creativity.
We are with you before and after and during this pandemic.
Naša škola je gde je đak, tu je i škola.
So as Professor Mohammed said, we are with you. That's what we need to tell our teachers. Today, we are pleased to introduce a number of speakers from our World Bank team to talk about what we have done during this time to support our country's effort. But then, after that short introduction, we're going to have a panel with diverse perspectives on how we can help countries to have an effective teacher for every child. In the panel, we're going to have Ranjit Disale, who is a teacher from the Zilla Parishad Primary School in India, and he's the 2020 Global Teacher Prize winner. We're going to have us also Morupe, who goes by Mo, at Efeso Olateju, who is a managing director of the Education Partnership Center, which is Nigeria's pioneering education partnership organization. We're going to have Janelle Kotse, who is Deputy Director of Research Coordination, Monitoring and Evaluation of the Department of Basic Education in South Africa. And we're going to have Professor Karthik Muralidharan, who is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at University of California, San Diego. I will be joining the panel as well, and the panel will be skillfully moderated by David Evans, who has been working a lot during the last years with the World Bank team on the different tools that we have been working on. And David is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. Let me close by saying that there is too much at stake for us not to act now. And we really need to continue our efforts. And I'm extremely happy that we're going to have that we're having this discussion in order to improve our the quality of the support that we all, not only as people working on education, but we all as societies provide to teachers. Let me just close saying that we need to make sure that every classroom has to have a competent, empowered, and motivated teacher. Thank you to all, and let me pass to Tara to start us off.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Tara Bete, Senior Economist at the World Bank, and also the Global Lead on Teachers, along with Ezequiel Molina. In the next 25 minutes or so, my colleagues and I are going to give you a quick tour of the World Bank's recent work on teachers. I will start by laying out the 5 key principles on which this work is based. Ezequiel Molina will then talk about how we have been operationalizing these principles. This will be followed with presentations by Elaine, Adele, and Manal, who will focus on specific challenges and lines of engagement that correspond to those. Thereafter, we are going to have a very exciting panel discussion, as mentioned by Jaime. So let me begin. Where would all of us be without our teachers? This is a good time perhaps to pause for a moment and think about our favorite teacher, or at least one of them. Mine was my 6th grade Hindi teacher. I was terrible at Hindi. A C+ was a good grade for me. And then came Mrs. Gore. She was amazing. She motivated me. She encouraged me to learn. And soon I really enjoyed her classes, enjoyed learning Hindi, started getting A's. We were all so happy in that class. Now, we know that research after research studies show that teachers are the single most important factor affecting student learning. But teaching effectively is really difficult. Most of our countries not only are unable to attract the best into teaching, but even when they get people into the profession, they're unable to support them to behave and operate as good professionals. The World Bank has been working with over 100 countries to strengthen teacher systems. And this work has acquired renewed urgency with the pandemic, which has made clear that teachers are indispensable in student learning, but they need to be supported in multiple ways. The World Bank's Global Platform for Successful Teachers, which was launched in 2019, identifies 5 key principles. The first principle is to attract the best into teaching. This is to make teaching attractive. And there are 4 main mechanisms. The first is to design compensation policies to attract the best. The second is to build career progression structures. The third is to have good working conditions. And the fourth is to improve the professional status of teaching. Countries such as Japan and Singapore, they pay their teachers well in comparison to other professions such as engineering and law. They have strong career progression structures. Teachers get paid their salaries on time. They don't have to enter classrooms with buffaloes in them. And most importantly, they're valued and respected. The second principle is to make pre-service education strong so that it can equip teachers to perform effectively. Here we focus on 3 main areas. One is to make entry into pre-service selective. As of now, just about anybody in most countries can enter teacher training colleges. This sets the bar for teachers relatively low. The second is to include an extensive practical component in pre-service curricula so that when teachers enter a classroom, it's not the first time that they're actually engaging with young children. The third is to help redress the learning deficits many teacher candidates bring with them when they enter the classroom. The third key principle is to promote meritocratic selection. Several countries have made a lot of advance on this key area. Countries in South Asia, for instance, all have teacher eligibility tests. Another important part of this is to put teachers on probationary periods where they're supported and where they're assessed for fit for profession. This has been comparatively harder to do. There are still countries such as Peru, Mexico, some states in India, which have been trying to do this. But recruiting teachers well is only one part of the whole agenda. The second part is to make sure that they're assigned to classrooms and allocated to these classrooms in a fair and transparent way and are able to contribute in the work that they do. So better data on allocation and rules-based policies. Again, this has been difficult, but there are countries and states within countries such as Karnataka in India and Mozambique that have made some progress here. The third is to evaluate and keep teachers accountable. Karthik has done some interesting work here. The next principle, principle 4, is to support and motivate teachers throughout their careers. This includes strong in-service teacher professional development that has proven to be effective, strong and effective school leadership, and to establish systems of professional accountability. We often think of professional accountability in terms of performance pay, but there are many other mechanisms, next slide, for performance accountability, such as peer observation, professional coaching, recognition of success, and these can be employed to motivate teachers to perform well. The fifth principle is to ensure that technology is used wisely and appropriately to help teachers reach every student effectively. The pandemic could not have made this more obvious. While teachers are indispensable for student learning, it is only if they can use technology well. Next slide. So to summarize, 5 key principles. make teaching attractive, improve pre-service education, promote meritocratic selection, provide high-quality professional development and school leadership, and use technology wisely. I'll now hand it over to Ezequiel Molina, who will tell us more about how the World Bank has been operationalizing these principles.
Thanks, Tara. So the question that you may have is, how do we go from these 5 principles to having empowered, motivated, and effective teachers teaching all the students? The Global Platform for Successful Teachers is a vehicle to accelerate change. It employs a 2-pronged approach to support countries. First, we work with countries to understand their challenges and provide technical advice and financial support to adopt and implement better policies. At the same time, we work with countries and partners to identify which resources and tools are needed to improve policies, and then work with academic and practitioners to develop those tools and help countries use those tools. There is a constant feedback loop between the country support work that we do and developing tools, as both of them are constantly updating each other. So how the World Bank is actually providing the technical and financial support? We are currently supporting the work of more than 18 million teachers. That is more than 1/3 of the teacher population in low and middle income countries, covering all the 5 principles that Tara mentioned. So while I can't go into all the things that we are doing, let me give you some examples. So for example, to make teaching attractive, we are working with Dominican Republic that has embarked on a comprehensive teacher reform that includes meritocratic selection, practical training, and teacher evaluation. To prepare teachers for the classroom, we are working with Ethiopia to improve their pre-service system, to strengthen the curriculum and create a practicum so that teachers actually get to practice with expert teachers and get feedback before they actually become teachers and go into the classroom. And finally, to improve teacher management, we are working with Malawi to develop a teacher database system of all the teachers posting and use that information to then improve teacher allocation, to then reduce teacher shortages. So this country support that I'm talking about is complemented by the development of tools and resources that to aid 3 critical aspects of policy: diagnostics, design, and implementation. So for instance, to improve diagnostic, we have developed many products, but one of our flagship products, the Global Education Policy Dashboard, is a school survey tool to understand what happens inside the school. What do teachers know and do? How are teachers supported? Combining all the best previous tools into just one. So as we develop, as I was saying, it's not just diagnostic, but it's also we're working in improving intervention design and implementation quality, drawing from the insight of the science of implementation to provide concrete guidance to countries. Adele will later on the presentation tell us an example of how we are providing those guidance notes to improve teacher professional development. We are also developing costing tools so countries understand their policy options that they have, from remote instruction to how to open schools safely after the pandemic. So it's not just the issue of the design, but also thinking about how we can enhance implementation. We know that too often implementation is lacking in projects. So what we are doing is working to develop tools for ongoing monitoring and feedback that could act as an early warning system for projects. As we develop these tools, we are working with partners guided by the evidence on our country work, as well as technical experts. As we develop these tools, we are putting all of them out for public consultation. So if you go to our webpage right now, you can see, you would be able to see many of these resources. You can check out our blog. You can see that we post it also on Twitter. You can email us because we want to hear from you to enhance the products that we are developing. And we also have a new newsletter that you are, that you should join, as well as a new podcast, which we had Ranjit as the first guest. So we're happy to have him. So next slide. As we go, it's not just the work that we do in terms of putting these tools out, but we are also constantly revising and updating the evidence behind the 5 principles. For that, we have established the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, that is a group of experts, which Kartik and Jaime are part of them and will be part of the panel, that allow us to keep us abreast of the latest evidence on cost-effective ways to improve teaching and learning. So now you may be asking, okay, this is great. I understand the theory behind what you're doing and how it's supposed to work, but can you give me 3 concrete examples of how the 2-pronged approach of country support and developing resources is actually works to improve the support of teachers on the ground? So for that, to answer that question, let me give it to Elaine, who will tell us how we're helping countries improve the way that we measure what happened in the classroom.
Thanks, Ate. Hi, everyone. If I were to ask you to describe education quality in your country, what would be the metrics that you use to describe it? Some of you may maybe describe the conditions of your schools. Others may know the enrollment rate or graduation rate. And some of you may even know your PISA score or ranking. How many of you would have described the interactions occurring inside of classrooms? Perhaps only a few. And yet, I think most of you would agree that what goes on inside the classroom is central to student learning. And in fact, we tend to go to great lengths to measure both inputs and outcomes, but we measure processes within classrooms far less often. Measuring process quality allows systems to track and improve teaching. And to support teachers in their day-to-day instruction, you begin by understanding what happens in their classrooms. Next slide. In 2019, our team launched the Teach Classroom Observation Tool with a vision to revolutionize how education systems track and improve teaching quality. It has since been applied in over 20 countries, providing a unique glimpse into an estimated 10,000 classrooms of nearly 250,000 students. It is observation tools like Teach that provide us a look inside the black box of the classroom. And these tools allow governments to monitor and measure the effectiveness of their policies and can feed into making teacher professional development more tailored, practical, and focused. Next slide. Since 2019, we've been developing, revising, and adapting tools to measure teaching practices in more breadth and depth. We have expanded our measurement efforts to include the years of focus of early childhood education, which I will refer to as ECE, and secondary education, with a focus on how to encourage teaching that is inclusive, responsive, and specific to the development needs of these age groups. The COVID-19 pandemic has also forced us to think more about how quality teaching might look like and how it might be measured in remote settings, which have been the impetus for 2 new upcoming lines of work. The first looks at ways to measure quality in remote classrooms and involves the adaptation of the Teach suite of tools to observe and assess the quality of virtual instruction. Additionally, we are working on developing online training for these tools, which can be accessible to users in low connectivity contexts. We are excited to be prototyping some innovative practices to reimagine large-scale, low-cost, and easily accessible training for enumerators. Throughout this expansion in breadth, we've also been going through a process of adapting all Teach tools to more finely measure inclusive teaching practices that support the diverse ways that we all learn. For example, by measuring indicators like the number of forms of representation used within a classroom, looking at whether teachers or learning materials exhibit or challenge ability and gender bias in the classroom, and measuring the accessibility of the language of instruction through looking at indicators like the official language of instruction and the number of children who speak that same language at home, as well as other measures, a sample of which you can see on your screen. This vision of inclusion lies at the heart of all of the measurement tools I profile, but I will focus on just one of them today, Teach ECE. On behalf of the entire team, I'm thrilled to be launching as part of today's event for the first time, the Teach ECE tool, which is a classroom observation tool designed for classrooms with children aged 3 to 6. The early childhood years are formative in shaping cognitive and socio-emotional trajectories. And ECE teaching is unique in that it spans a highly diverse range of pedagogical approaches. A key objective of the Teach ECE tool is to measure that spectrum of quality that could range from teacher-directed to more child-centered and play-based learning. Importantly, Teach ECE was designed to be resource independent, reflecting the realities of ECE in the countries that we work, but also, and more importantly, reflecting what we know from research, which is that young children do not need fancy infrastructure or equipment in order to learn. Teach ECE embeds an explicit focus on both the time that ECE teachers spend on learning activities, as well as the quality of ECE teaching practices that help to develop children's cognitive and socio-emotional skills. It also measures cross-cutting themes that are critical to quality early learning, for example, the use of language to facilitate learning and the presence and quality of child-centered activities in the classroom. In most countries, the ECE workforce tends to be the least trained and least professionalized workforce in the education system. And it is our sincere hope that through providing a common framework to understand and discuss teaching quality, that classroom observations in ECE can contribute to the dialogue on the importance of supporting and ultimately further professionalizing the ECE workforce. Over the past 2 years, the Teach ECE tool has undergone multiple rounds of in-country piloting in contexts as varied as the Dominican Republic, Pakistan, Mongolia, and Romania. And while these are early days, here are some examples of how teams have used or are planning on using the Teach ECE tool. In Mongolia, for example, Teach ECE observation results were used to evaluate the impact of free and quality kindergartens on women's labor force participation. In the DR, the government is planning on using Teach ECE as a tool to monitor a project indicator focused on the quality of ECE. At the same time, they are using the process of training policymakers and stakeholders on the tool as a way to deepen and advance local understanding of quality ECE. Teach ECE is launched with a suite of resources, next slide, that mirror the Teach Primary suite of resources. And the objective is to make the tool straightforward to apply, both off the shelf and in a modular fashion, customizable to country context. Supplementary resources are all available on our website, which launches today. You'll be able to find the manual and other materials in English, Spanish, and Arabic, with more languages available in the coming weeks. We encourage you to browse these resources at your leisure, to remain engaged in the conversation about the importance of measuring classroom practices, and to stay tuned for updates on our tools for secondary, for virtual classroom observations, and our virtual master trainings, which will commence this summer. I'm now thrilled to hand over to Adele, who will discuss the COACH program to support countries to improve in-service teacher professional development.
Perfect. Thank you, Elaine.
شكرا إيلين.
So as Elaine alluded to earlier,
كما أشارت إيلين مبكرا.
Oh, I think it's is that one of our Arabic translators?
Oh.
Thank you. So as Elaine alluded to earlier, following the rollout of Teach, as countries began to see data on what was going on in the classroom, the next question was, now what? How do we use these data to better support teachers and to encourage better teaching practices in the classroom? So drawing from the science of adult learning and behavior change, we know that there are 4 evidence-based principles.
التغيير نحن نعرف
of how to change teaching practices in the classroom. So the principles are that teacher training should be tailored to teachers' needs and experiences, that teachers should receive practical training, that teachers should receive training that is focused on a few key skills at a time, and finally, that teachers should receive ongoing support throughout the school year and throughout their careers. We rarely see existing teacher professional development or TPD programs that align with these principles, and part of our work in the global platform will be to support countries to improve their TPD. This is where COACH comes in. Unlike Teach, COACH is not a tool, but rather a program to support countries improve in-service teacher professional development. It is called COACH because coaching programs embody these 4 principles, but we will meet countries where they are and help them think through how their in-service TPD can best encapsulate these 4 principles, even if coaching is not yet possible. Like as I mentioned earlier, we're providing support via tools and resources, as well as through financial and technical support to countries. So I'll now provide some examples of tools and resources to support design and implementation of effective TPD. First, for design, we're developing resources that countries can use when designing or improving their in-service TPD systems by aligning them with the 4 coach principles. For example, we have the Structuring One-to-One Support Guide, the cover of which you see on your screens, which provides concrete suggestions based on an analysis of 10 high-impact coaching programs in low and middle-income countries for how education systems can provide teachers with ongoing support. It provides guidance on questions such as, what should be the ratio of pedagogical leaders to teachers? How frequently should pedagogical leaders visit teachers? And how long should observation and feedback sessions be? It also talks about considerations for remote or virtual coaching. In addition, we're developing materials to support the implementation of effective TPD. For example, we've developed the Foundational Teaching Skills Guide that provides teacher trainers and coaches with precise prompts on how to help teachers understand, practice, and form habits around new pedagogical skills. This initial set of foundational teaching skills in the guide was chosen because they were applicable to everyday classroom instruction, supported by evidence, observable in practice, and simple to learn and to coach on. The guide contains step-by-step guidance on how to implement these teaching practices in the classroom. It suggests an order of skills to work on, provides guidance on when these practices should be incorporated, and gives an example of how a teacher would go about applying the teaching skills in the classroom. The guide is versatile and can feed into pre-service training, in-service training, coaching sessions, teacher's guide, and even teacher self-study. And finally, as an example of how the bank is providing technical and financial support to countries to improve their TPD, I'm going to share some ongoing work that we have in Mozambique. We're currently working with the government of Mozambique on the Aprender Mais program, which means learn more or learn better. The Aprender Mais program has the overall goal of improving early grade reading outcomes, particularly as schools reopen following a year of school closures due to the pandemic. And it has a strong emphasis on instructional coherence. That is the alignment of pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment. As such, we are working with other units within the government and other teams within the bank to ensure coherence across these different areas. Zooming in on the teacher training component of the Aprender Mais program, we're supporting the government, particularly the teacher training unit, in designing and implementing a coaching system so that coaches observe teachers in their classrooms twice a month and then provide teachers with feedback and opportunities to practice. We have also supported the government in developing materials for teacher and coach training, as well as structured materials for coaches to use in the coaching sessions. We have drawn heavily from the global coach tools and resources in providing this support to the government. And likewise, this experience of working in Mozambique has fed back into the scope and content of the global tools and resources. For example, it has helped us really think through how the foundational teaching skills should be presented to teachers and coaches in a way that is easily understandable and applicable. The Aprender Mais program will be piloted this year, and the learnings from this pilot will inform national scale-up of the approach over the coming years. As part of the coach program and the broader global platform, we hope to be able to support other countries in a similar way. I will now hand the floor over to Manal, who will be talking about how we're helping countries to use technology effectively to enhance TPD.
Thanks, Adele. So today what I'll be doing is building off the presentations that Elaine and Adele have given to really talk about the World Bank's efforts to use technology wisely to support improved in-service teacher professional development. But before we jump in, I'd like to draw on some important lessons and 3 key points and takeaways that I'd like you to remember that I'm going to present in this next slide. In the next slide, please. Great. Okay. So first, this is building off of the work for supporting using technology to support teachers. First, I would like us all to remember that technology on its own is not the solution to the learning crisis. It can, however, help us address specific problems in education. Policy and practitioners should really start by asking themselves a simple question. What's the best way to solve this problem? And can technology help in this case? So when approached problem by problem, education systems can have realistic expectations of the promise of technology and ensure that they help teachers to help their students. 2, technology has many benefits, and we need to identify the right entry points for technology and to be clear on the beneficial attributes that technology may bring. One of those, for example, may be reaching more people at scale, reducing costs over time, and improving the quality of contact time through more frequent or better quality engagements. But before we consider any system-wide changes, we need to be sure that technology works. Is it being used? And does it actually lead to increases in student learning? 3, regardless of how cutting edge a technological solution is, it doesn't operate in isolation. Technology is always part of a larger ecosystem of school climate and classroom resources like instructional materials. We also have to consider local capacity and willingness to integrate tech-based solutions, because this will also determine the success of implementation. This was just a quick run through of some of the key points that I want you to remember. And also there's a report you can link to, which Dave Evans, our moderator, was the author of. So now let's actually jump into the meat of this and think about technology and how can technology really be used to scale and enhance teacher professional development. So let's remember, when we think about technology, we know that it has to be for it to be effective, it has to act on teaching practices. This is no different when we're introducing technology. So we need to think about what are the key bottlenecks at the different stages of TPD delivery. And that's really your first line here in the presentation. We're thinking about tailored access, focused, practical, ongoing, and all of those are the coach principles. But we also want to think about the technological value added or the benefits that it has to bring and try and marry those two together. For example, in Lebanon, teacher coaching, especially after the pandemic and the effects of COVID-19, had to move from face-to-face to virtual or remote support. And what we need to know here is that technology, the attribute that it brings in, which is greater connectivity at a higher scale, can help with means like virtual coaching. But whether this is done through a tablet, through a phone, mobile phone, or other means is really dependent on the context. But the point is, how do we make sure that we're acting on TPD practices, like in this case in Lebanon, and how that is supporting others? Other examples that I wanted to bring forward is the case of India, where coaches are receiving additional support. Rural teachers, for example, get video lessons that are focused on specific curricular line content and gives teacher a model for them to allow to follow. And that's really the second example, falls lines with our second principle. And I hope that you can all still see the slides, even though I don't currently see it up there, but it might just be a technical glitch. The third example that I wanted to provide is Zambia, where teachers are also given the opportunity to use WhatsApp to facilitate in-depth conversations about some new teaching practices they're receiving. Again, the technological attribute here is that it's allowing for more teachers to engage, to think through issues using a virtual or online platform, or essentially using technology. And we also know that technology in certain contexts can be used for incentives and nudging, and Peru is Jaime's favorite country case or example, had an SMS rapid deployment strategy where it was reaching teachers through remote means. So here are just a few examples of what the World Bank is trying to do when it's thinking through TPD and technology. But then on the next slide, we're also going to show you how we try and make this a little bit more concrete, and that we're not doing this in isolation. We're really investigating these new areas of support in collaboration with others, such as the EdTech Hub, RTI, UNESCO, and others. And we're doing this through our financial and technical support and working through countries, working on policy planning and also evaluations, but also through our resources and tools and thinking innovatively, especially in the time of COVID, by trying, for example, to crowdsource new ideas, to bring in solutions that we may not have considered, and then to disseminate that and share it with audiences. So I hope this short presentation gives you an idea of how we can use technology more wisely. And right now I'll hand over to our moderator, Dave Evans. Hey, Dave, I hope you're ready to push through and get a fun panel started where we can have and engage in a lot of great questions and discussions.
Thanks so much, Manal. thanks to Jaime, thanks to all these speakers for, and it looks like, yeah, we've got some exciting errant noise. Thanks to Jaime and all these speakers. This has been a tidal wave of content, or maybe the right analogy is a buffet, where there are lots of available tools that systems and people who support systems can draw on to support teachers in different ways. I also, encourage people to follow the chat. There are a lot of good resources. So Jaime already introduced the panel earlier, and so I'm going to jump right in. I also encourage you to put questions that you have for the panel into the chat, and a little bit later we'll be drawing on those and bringing them to the fore. So, I think everybody on this panel, has some experience in different, obviously we all have experience from the education system. Many of us have taught at different levels. We have just one person on the panel who is a current classroom teacher, Ranjit. So I'd like to start, this is since this is an event on teachers, I'd like to start with our teacher. So Ranjit, I'd just love to hear from you, your perspective on the unique challenges and solutions to effectively supporting teachers, especially during this pandemic. So, what's hard about helping teachers during the pandemic, and what can systems do to do that effectively?
Thanks, David. Thanks for calling me. And it's good to see that teachers' voice is respected, not only in India, but across the world and through the World Bank. It's good to see how you guys are doing for the best teachers, for the great teachers. So when you talk about teachers need support during the pandemic, so, this pandemic has taught us a lesson that we should invest in teachers and teaching professional development. But what happened? Countries have cut down the budget on the education, teachers have lost their jobs. So when you talk about and monitoring the classroom engagement, what about the teachers, those who have lost their jobs? We should talk about that as well. Another perspective that what are the problems of teachers during the pandemic? Economical, social, psychological problems, and well-being, social well-being problems as well. So these are some of the new emerged problems of teaching profession. I'm talking about their existence not only in virtual classrooms but in the society as well. So I think we should raise the foundation, we should raise the bar without lowering a ceiling. In my opinion, most important factor in providing quality education is to create great teachers and empower them to do great things, right? But outside my classroom duties, I often engage in teachers training, how to introduce technology in teaching. And over the last few years, I have trained thousands of teachers in this way. To get the best out of our students, we must become a teacher of 21st century. David, it has been said that the students of 21st century are being taught by teachers of 20th century using that 19th century curriculum on an 18th century techniques. So we need to bridge that gap, and technology can help us to bridge that gap. We must ensure teachers are trained to high standard. They employ different learning styles and use technology wherever it is possible. Because empowered students can only be nurtured by empowered teachers. And that's why teachers need to be in touch with their creative energize and enthusiasm and use it in the classrooms. To help to promote fresh ways of teaching, I decided to give 30% of my Global Teacher Prize money to create a special teacher innovation fund, because their idea, their innovation should be respected and should be implemented across the state or across the world. This is because I have often seen good ideas failed due to lack of resources, where they might thrive with just a little financial help. I also decided to share 50% of my prize money with other top 10 finalists, because who are no less than innovative and worthy of prize than me. So I know they will use this prize money wisely and effectively to really create a step change in how teachers are viewed and valued, however more than money is needed for that. So I think governments, NGOs, schools need to collaborate, collect the data on successful teaching practices, and ensure that the best use is made of resources. Looking to the future, we as a global society have to realize that failing to educate children in poorer countries will only deepen and postpone the problems facing us in the century. To solve these challenges, we are going to need educated, creative leaders of every type and background in every part of the globe. So if teachers, governments, and other private stakeholders can work together, we can make this a reality. But the time for action is now, not then, not later than never. So I think you, as a World Bank, I see because I saw that you have an advisory board, but something clicked in my mind. Whether do you have a teacher as an advisor? If not, just try to think of it, because teachers from grassroots can put their ideas, and if they can put their ideas with the help of as advisor in a World Bank, I think you will get ideas, problems from grassroots. Now you are tackling problems, monitoring through the technology. But what about the voices of teachers, those who are teaching in the classrooms? I'm very happy you invited me as a classroom teacher who is still teaching his students. I'm so thankful to you as well.
Thank you so much for that, and we're so happy to have you and get those perspectives. I want to take something that you said and pose it to Mo. So Mo, something Ranjit said was about this point that there are a lot of great initiatives, but there isn't enough financing for them. So in the midst of the pandemic, you know, and I know you've done a lot of work on sort of teaching and early learning in Nigeria, obviously a very different context. What do you see as the challenges teachers are facing, and what kinds of initiatives could use more resources, just like Ranjit was talking about?
I think that's a great question, David. And I almost want to start by unpacking who the teacher is, because it's that big question in 2021. Is the teacher the parent as well as the parent the teacher? And we had all these challenges in Nigeria. But I think that the challenges that have been identified from the Indian context, for example, are very, very similar to the challenges that we experienced in Nigeria. And with teachers agitating for greater investment in infrastructure and in pedagogy, the need for internet data, the need for strong internet connections and access, access as well to technological devices, such as smartphones and computers as well. I think it's also interesting that the pandemic created an opportunity for the kind of innovation that we have perhaps not experienced in the Nigerian context in recent years. And maybe just to talk very briefly about two examples, one from the south of Nigeria and one from the north of Nigeria. Within the context of southern Nigeria, looking specifically at Lagos State now, Lagos was one of the first states, if not the first one, to respond to the pandemic, arguing that they would not let their children undergo any sort of learning loss. And the response of the state, upon reflection, was really focused on activating the agency of teachers as professionals, realizing that we were in a situation that the world had never been in before, and this was the time to help teachers appreciate that they could create and they could innovate. And what they did was to build a safe space, where secondary school teachers, for example, could begin to experiment with content and pedagogy, instruction in the way that they hadn't done before. And so they were allowed to set up Telegram groups. We have Telegram schools in Nigeria now. We have WhatsApp schools in Nigeria, lots and lots of teachers, hundreds of teachers on these groups. They were given an opportunity to unpack the curriculum. So for example, in Lagos State now, there is a focus on core skills. And so there is a column in every scheme of work focused on what core skills are children supposed to take away at the end of this lesson. And then there was also, you mentioned funding, in your remarks to me, the question that you posed to me. There was also a sense in which the state began to very aggressively channel some of its resources and harness resources from the private sector as well, through massive campaigns. And so they were able to procure I think it was almost 1 million radio sets to give to children to enable the radio schooling, 20,000 devices for children who are in grade 12 and preparing for their school leaving examinations, partnering with Microsoft to provide very hands-on capacity development to teachers across the state. I personally have never seen this happen within the context of the public sector. And you know, I think one aspect that also jumped out at me was the focus on socio-emotional learning as well. And, you know, helplines provided to learners for them to contact their teachers and share challenges that they were facing. And it wasn't just in the South. In the north of Nigeria, the Reading and Numeracy Activity RANA program, which is implemented in 6 different states across both the northeast and northwest of Nigeria, also focused on continuous professional development, but in bite sizes, in sizes that teachers could chew on, and in a way that they'd be able to absorb and utilize immediately. And I think it was also interesting that within the north of Nigeria, just as the south, we saw a lot of focus being placed on establishing these communities of practice where teachers could learn and share with one another. Some were very low tech, others were higher tech. And I think it's what Manal was talking about earlier about using tech wisely. And first of all, understanding what tech is and what tech should be able to do for you depending on your context. So I think in summary, it's interesting that, and of course, there's a lot of data to show that learning actually did increase as a result of some of these approaches. But I think, you know, that Pygmalion effect and being able to appeal to the agency of the teacher as a professional, regardless of what kind of professional qualification they bring to the table, insofar as they are professional and they have received some teacher training, understanding that they can create and they can innovate, I think helped to address some of the issues. Of course, there's still many issues, but helped to address some of the issues that we saw within the Nigerian context.
Thank you so much. This is, I think this, both, providing a wide array of tools to support teachers and also this sort of whole scaffolding of technological solutions, right? That it's not all going to be sort of, interactive WebEx classrooms or Zoom classrooms. There are a range of things. So something that you've talked about and that Ranjit talked about both extensively is teacher professional development. And you've also both talked about like sort of the technology to do this. And so for this next bit, I'd like to turn to Yanali. So I know in South Africa, you've been doing a lot of work. I've been following it closely on teacher professional development, including some experiments to integrate technology into that. So tell us a little bit about what you see great teacher professional development looking like, how that might be different right now, during a pandemic, and what the promise and limits of technology might be there.
Oh, great. Thank you, Dave. So I think for in-service professional development to be really useful, we really need to understand the context that we're in and the context that teachers are facing in the classroom. And we know now it's much different than it was a year ago. So in South Africa, for instance, we still have regulations in place to ensure that there's social distancing in the classrooms. And for the majority of our schools, this means that only half of the kids can come to school at a certain time. And teachers only see children then on a rotational basis, and they don't actually see children on every single day. So this has obviously led to a lot of learning losses. And the implication of this is, and we did, some learners at the end of last year, and we are estimating that with learning losses in terms of just the 2020 year has been about 75% of a year of learning for home language reading outcomes, about 50% of a year of learning for English outcomes. And these learners went through to the next year. So the teachers at this point are facing a cohort of learners that have learned substantially less than they have in previous cohorts. So the gap between what the children can do or the skill set that they have and what the curriculum expects of them are wider than it's ever been previously. And I think Jaime also said this earlier, even before the learning crisis, we knew that there was this massive gap, and this gap is even wider than it's been previously. So what South Africa has done to try and mitigate some of these complexities is to say, let's implement a 3-year curriculum recovery plan that revises the teaching plans, that reduces the curriculum that learners are expected to learn. And then some of the higher grades, this may make some sense where you can drop a topic here that might not be as essential. But in the foundation phase, where kids need to learn how to read, they need to know how to do basic mathematics, it's not as easy as just dropping as aspects of the curriculum, and guiding teachers through these complexities is absolutely critical. I loved how Mo mentioned that this is a space where teachers need to innovate and start thinking about it. So what we did before the pandemic, to seeing and evaluating how we can support teachers better, how can we support them in changing their daily practices better, as we did the study that you also mentioned, where we like to see to what extent can virtual coaching play a role, and can it be as effective as in-person coaching. And to test this, we provided teachers with devices, we provided them with electronic lesson plans, videos, audio clips, examples of teachers' work. We tried to put as many resources as possible on this device, but then we also had a virtual coach that would phone them up to 4 times a term, that would check in how this teacher is doing, how is he managing covering this curriculum, is she managing with the new activities, really to provide that emotional support, but in a virtual setting. There was also WhatsApp groups. We really tried to have various ways of using technology to support the teaching in the classroom. And we learned a lot of lessons. I think the first lesson was just that electronic devices wasn't necessarily a barrier. And that is a big question that we had, given that the average age of our teacher in the study was about 50 years. And the largest majority of them are much older. And that was a question we looked at, and we realized that wasn't a barrier. For instance, we tracked how many times teachers opened their lesson plans, and this was quite a lot at the start of the term, but it dwindled as the term went on. But then all of a sudden, in week 7 out of the 10 weeks, we saw this shot up again in teachers opening these lesson plans. And we noticed, well, this is the week where assessment takes place. So teachers, there's an external motivation for opening these lesson plans and using them. And that made us start thinking on, but why? Why is this external motivation so important? And I think that's the second big lesson that we learned, is that the virtual support to the teachers worked well, but it mostly worked for teachers who are already open to change. And I think that made us realize that for the larger majority of teachers, and I think that is similar for the largest majority of us on the school, change is always met with a certain level of resistance. Overcoming this resistance generally requires a trusting relationship with someone whose opinion and insights you trust. And we found that the in-person coaches were much better and much more effective in building these trusting relationships than the virtual coach. If you don't want to change, it's really easy to just avoid a telephone call. It's easy to avoid a message, or even for compliance sake, take the call, but kind of give the coach the answers that you think she might want to hear. So I think in applying these lessons to this current context, I think that exactly what Manuel mentioned is to say that the EdTech can work, but you really have to think properly through how you're going to be implementing it. There's many limitations that need to be thought through. The question that I think governments often get stuck on is, how are we going to find devices? Where can we get connectivity to kids in especially rural settings? And to be honest, that's actually that's a supply chain question, that's a funding question, that's relatively easy to solve. I think the more important question, and this is a conversation that I very rarely hear, is what's the content on these devices? The device itself will not support the teacher, but a tailored focus of practical content on this device could provide some guidance and support. But then the next step is, how do we motivate and encourage teachers to actually use the device if they are in contexts where it's more difficult, if they are in contexts where the social, emotional space is more complex? I think this is where coaches can play a role. But that's also a lesson we learned, is that just a virtual coach might not be enough. You need to build that relationship. So I think what we are recommending at this point is to say, how can we use a blended support? How can we build a trusting relationship in person first, and then start migrating to a virtual space and use that as the ongoing aspect of support? So I think from my perspective, technology and virtual means of support can be useful supplements, but unfortunately they're not a magic wand, and we really need to think through how we apply it.
Thanks so much. And I think obviously there was a lot there of lessons we can learn. One thing that I took from that also is, this point about, the teacher professional development, the coaching, it worked best, and the technology worked best, but teachers who were ready to engage change, right? And I think, like we have, Ranjit here on our panel, who's a very inspiring example of a teacher. Tara talked at the beginning of the session to, invited us all to remember, a meaningful teacher, and I have many. But I also think, a lot of us who've worked in the education sector know there are lots of different kinds of teachers. And there are lots of different reasons that people go into the teaching profession. And there are many who go in because they're passionate about teaching. There are others that go in for other reasons. And education systems have to grapple with all of those teachers. So I'd like to turn to Karthik. Karthik, I've heard you express a little bit of skepticism sometimes in the past about some of the teacher professional development interventions. And so, if we stop the panel right now, it'd be like, all right, let's get some ed tech out and let's provide some support to the teachers, and we'll be sort of living in a Xanadu of amazing pedagogy. So, do you feel is this what systems should be investing heavily in? And if not, what should they be doing instead or in complement, especially during the crisis?
Thanks, David. Can you hear me there?
Yes.
No, thanks. First of all, it's been a wonderful panel. Congratulations to Tara, Ezekiel, and the entire team. I've really enjoyed, just seeing both how research informed the content you put out is, as well as the quality of the practical support that you're then creating in terms of these tools for partner countries and governments. So again, I commend you on all of this. I think, and it's also remarkable how much I agree with everything that's been said so far, right? I think David almost set me up as a contrarian to come and say something, but I actually agree with everything that's been said. Okay, so the question here is, now, but I will serve the contrarian function that David wanted me to, right? Which is kind of, in this. Essentially, here's the problem, right? The problem, like David alluded to, is that the people in this room are kind of at the extreme right tail of the motivation distribution for what we do, right? And the problem is that when we kind of look at the best, of course, we think that everything is great. But when you take what we are trying to do and scale this up in developing country systems, you then have to go look at the data. And that's my job as a researcher. And, I think... And in addition to kind of my own research, I'm also the global head of education for JPAL. So which means we review tons and tons of research from across the world and have a sense of just what the data is telling us. So here's the bad news. Okay, the bad news is, while I agree with everything that's been said here about the importance of teaching, okay, and I'm a teacher myself, okay, so it's really hard for me to not believe in the importance of teachers and teaching because that's what I do for a living, okay, but here's the bad news. The bad news is, when you go look at the data, when you go look at large-scale studies in representative samples across a range of countries, there are almost no studies that find a meaningful correlation between having a teacher training credential and your effectiveness in the classroom, okay? So the thing is, we all understand that teacher training and teacher quality is important. What we don't yet know is how to deliver this at scale, because the way developing country or most education systems implement the idea that teacher training matters is to require formal certification, is to require formal credentialing before you can enter the classroom, okay? Now, the problem is that the evidence suggests that this is almost like a pointless credential, that we're pushing after a credential that has no impact. Okay, so where is the disconnect? Okay, so why is there no impact? Now, and there's three broad sets of reasons. And again, I know India best, and that's where most of my own work is, but this broad pattern is seen in most parts of the world. So I think the first problem is that many of the degrees, so remember, what is the research saying? The research is comparing teachers with a teacher training credential versus teachers who don't, okay? But if there's no difference, one big reason is that many of the degrees are fake, okay? So if you go to India, right, there are fake degree mills. So the former education secretary of India, Anil Swarup, he used to be the coal secretary, and he said something very interesting. He said, I went from coal to education, and in coal, the mafias are above the ground. In education, the mafias are below the ground, okay? So it's actually the opposite, and you don't see the mafias, but they're all kind of running these rackets of fake teacher training colleges and giving out these degrees. And so, of course, it's not a surprise that having a fake credential has no effect, okay? Now, So obviously one part of this is tightening up the quality, the teacher entrance test and things we're doing like that in India obviously are a step in the right direction. But I think the second and deeper problem is now think about the genuine degree, okay? So this is a legitimate degree. You have candidates who've studied, who passed an exam and have a degree, okay? But if you go look at the content analysis of these teacher training programs, almost all of it is history, theory, philosophy, sociology of education, okay? But with remarkably little practicum based training of how do you actually teach. And so you basically get teachers with credentials who passed exams and show up on day one to a class of 25 screaming kids, and you have no idea what to do. And there's nothing in your training that's actually prepared you for this. Okay, so again, I think I strongly agree with what Tara and Zeke said, that you need a lot more practicum-based kind of focus in your teacher training programs. And I'll come back to technology in a second. And then the third reason is that even with good teacher training, the effectiveness of that training depends on the motivation that the teacher has in the classroom. Okay, so, and given the demotivated environment in which most teachers in large public systems work, that the training does not translate into improved learning outcomes. And we have evidence from multiple studies. Okay, so the way to think about this is that quality is knowledge times effort. Okay, it's what do I know and what do I do? Okay, so the training gives you knowledge, but it doesn't change your motivation to act on that knowledge within the classroom. Okay, so we have high quality studies saying that a good training program delivered in private schools has an effect, but when delivered in public schools has no effect because the teachers are taking up the training materials, attending the workshops, and then locking it up in a cupboard and not changing practice. Okay, so that goes back to what Janelli was saying, that when we observe that this content is effective, we're observing it with the motivated teachers, and that's a small subset of your system. And on average, you're not changing. If you don't change motivation, it's like knowledge times effort, right? So if I boost up knowledge without changing effort, the returns to that are very low. Okay, so that's kind of what the research is telling us. So I don't think the implication of that is we don't do teacher training. It is that we kind of follow through understanding why the status quo is not working and then try and improve what we're doing. Okay, so and I'm really happy to see so much of the work the bank team has done. And let me add like two major thoughts. Okay, so one is I think there's a lot we can learn from medical education as to how to do teacher education better. Okay, and the first is just better research and effective teaching. Okay, which I think frankly, if you look at the status of research and pedagogical practices, sometimes I feel it's like where medicine was 100 years ago. So what do we know about effective teaching? We know very little. We often put outstanding teachers as exemplars of teach us what to do, but we don't know how much of what they do is because of their intrinsic traits versus something that are translatable to an average teacher. Okay, so we don't in fact know enough about effective teaching. But I think there's more to this, right? So there's this very interesting cognitive disconnect between how we approach medical education and teacher education. Okay, so in medical education, it's almost like the quality of education is considered to be good if the quality of treatment I get is the same regardless of which doctor I see. Okay, because the whole point is that I am training you to a certain professional standard, that regardless of which of 100 trained doctors I see, I should get a certain standardized protocol of treatment. Whereas with teachers, like with teacher training, I think we've gone too far down this idea of teacher as a hero and wanting kind of each teacher to individually figure things out like in their classroom without supporting them with research and evidence-based just kind of modest amounts of scripting. Okay, now this is not to say you make the teacher a robot and saying this is what you're going to do. Of course, you need the creativity and autonomy to respond to the conditions in the classroom, but I think we can do a lot more in terms of modest amounts of standardizing of what good instructional practice looks like, as opposed to leaving it to every teacher to kind of figure out. So that's the second point. I think the third thing to learn from medical education is how much more practical training there is. Okay, so the bulk of effective medical education happens on your rotations and not so much in your classroom. Okay, and so building in more practical training and rotations into teacher training, I think will be great. And the last thing, and this is the most important missing piece which nobody talked about, which I think Janelli was kind of alluding to, which is in the end, what makes the medical education stick is the fact that you have to be board certified to have a certain standard of knowledge before you can practice. Okay, so the two things to learn from medicine is that one, there's continuing medical education. Two, you have to get recertified every 10 years. Okay, and you cannot practice if you cannot show that you have imbibed the newer knowledge that there is and stayed current. Okay, so for every wonderful teacher like Ranjit, we've got 10 teachers like who are, who are teaching our kids every day, who often barely know the content of what they're supposed to teach. Okay, and like David was alluding to, education systems are very political, recruitment is very political, so you will often get many teachers in your system who frankly have no business being teachers. And if you were able to kind of slowly increase the standards by requiring not just continual education, but continual demonstration of your knowledge for your professional development, then that's going to be an important part. Okay, so the piece I'm going to highlight is I think the bank's team has created some fantastic content, right? But how do we then build this integration into systems? So the last point I'm going to talk about is then technology as a force multiplier, right? Because I think it allows us to hit like all of these. So I see the comment about the pay, and I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, but I think the technology in a way, and I forget, I think it was Manal who said this, right? That instead of thinking about technology as a silver bullet, let's first have clarity in what is the problem we're trying to solve, and then see how technology can help address that problem, okay? So to the extent that the problem we have is huge and variable content quality in teacher training, the technology can help standardize and create modules of high quality content, by people like Ranjit, who can literally model what effective teaching looks like. The second piece it allows you to do is build in a lot more practicum-based training so that the bite-sized modules you're getting on your smartphone are literally 5-minute demonstration lessons of here's how you may teach, right? And then the technology allows you to build these virtual communities, allows you to do the virtual coaching, peer groups, and all of this is fantastic. But the piece that's missing, which I would strongly urge us to also focus on as the World Bank in your conversations with country governments, is how do you build teacher demonstration of competence on these technology platforms to be part of your professional development. Okay, so right now most countries' education systems require 10 to 15 days of annual professional development. In practice, we know this quality is incredibly varied, right? I mean, and in focus group discussions, teachers will tell you this is really just a social occasion. They're lucky if they learn something. Okay, now if you can take the content that you've created in all of your tools and make this a part of saying, teachers, you have the freedom to design what areas you want to focus on each year, but you're going to have to complete a certain number of hours of content on this platform. So I think India has Diksha, which is, now they haven't added this kind of the professional development part, sorry, the career trajectory part of this. But imagine that you had to take a certain amount of content and you had to pass a modular test. At the end of every piece, you pass the test. And at the end of a year, you put together some of these modules and saying, here's like a little course, which I need to show that I have done. And passing that course to a certain standard becomes a part of your professional development trajectory about your increments, your promotions, your postings, and all the things that teachers care about. Okay, so I think, Lan Pritchett once famously said, he said, supply and demand matter as much for outcomes as it's like demand and supply matter as much as gin and tonic matter, okay? In a drink, okay? So often we do supply, and the supply looks good without focusing enough on the demand of how do you make sure that the systems are institutionalized to value the high quality content that's being created, okay? So I think the technology gives us a platform to really do great things. And the one place where the COVID may be these long-term positive is in kind of forcing us all to think really, creatively about how we leverage technology to solve these problems at scale. So let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Karthik. And I think what we can learn from medical education, obviously there's a lot there. I think one of the things that this points to that comes straight out of this, right, is if we imagine reforming an education system and implementing something like, okay, every 10 years, teachers actually have to be not just receive a little bit of professional development every year, but they actually have to be recertified, right? And that has implications for their salary or for their or for whether they're able to remain in the profession. So I want to ask Jaime. So Jaime has been a minister in government and in your current role. Obviously, you spend a lot of time talking to ministers of education and others. So how can countries actually implement this kind of major change to the teacher career, right? Like not just providing, yes, providing more support, but also, accompanying that support with, giving that support some teeth so that, people really take it seriously and do something with it. Especially in the context of strong teachers associations or teachers unions, how can countries get that work done?
Thanks. Thanks, Dave. I'm sorry I was not able to find the unmute button. So look, yeah, the question that you're posing is the how-to, right? And it's kind of like say, well, we all agree on many of the things that that people are saying here. Why is that not happening, right? And one thing that I want to bring up again of something that I mentioned at the beginning, but that Karthik has mentioned as well, is that the challenge that we have is that anything that we say about how a good teacher looks like, the challenge is that we cannot rely on saying, well, we have some great teachers that are heroes. That's great to have that. The problem is that we want all our children to be in front of a hero in that case, right? That's the challenge, right? We just cannot afford, right, to have a teacher that is not well motivated or well prepared because he's in front or she's in front of 40 kids or 50 or 80 kids, right? So that then the problem is not the teacher. The problem is what's the service and the support that we're giving as a society to those 80 children. So that is the problem, right? How anything that we say, right? How then can we transform in something that will change the teacher's career and the teacher's profession as a whole, right? This pandemic has shown that first, education is a human interaction intensive endeavor, right? So yes, technology might help or it has helped, but at the end of the day, what we say is that, look, there are many teachers who have tried to do as best as they could, right? Using WhatsApp, I mean, whatever, I mean, sending lessons or just, I mean, taking lessons to their students' homes. I mean, they're trying to find a way in order to give something to their students in this complex juncture. But has that happened with all teachers? And the answer is no, right? That has happened with a group of great teachers. But actually, this pandemic has also shown that there are some teachers that are fantastic, that are motivated, and they have used high tech, medium tech, low tech, whatever, right, in order to reach their children. But that has not happened with all children, right? Hence, everything that we were talking about inequality in education before, now it's amplified many times with the pandemic. So the question of the challenge with pandemic, even worse, but the challenge even before that was how do we change the whole teachers' professional development, how we change the career as a whole. And there is that when we say, we need to, someone was saying, we need to work in a two-pronged approach, right? And yes, we need to have system that makes the whole career more accountable and more meritocratic. And at the same time, we need to have a system that provides the right support to teachers, right? And when you talk about how to implement this at scale, one thing that comes to my mind is that what's the type of discussion that we have with unions, right, when we talk about the teacher's profession? And it's correct, we have a discussion about the structure of pay, about teachers and about teachers' pay and about salaries and bonuses and all the shortcomings that exist on that front. And that's fine. I mean, we should discuss that. But we also need to discuss with the unions, right, in terms of, I mean, are we giving you the right type of professional development and the right type of support so that the teacher practice can improve, right? And I think we're already seeing in many discussions with unions, but not everywhere, that look, I mean, the way we have been training teachers, right, has been really a failure, right, during the last 30, 40 years. I mean, gigantic amounts of money that have basically failed. Why? Because we have not recognized that the teacher profession is about a skill that can be developed and it's about a performance that the teacher has to have with their children, right? And therefore, it's not about theory, it's about teaching about practice, right? It's teaching or help teachers, right, in improving their instructional practices in such a way that on Monday, there can be a change. And that's the type of teachers' professional development that we do not see, right? So, and the shifts that we do towards that type of practical training is absolutely essential. So that's why, for instance, this classroom observation tools, right? Like Teach, right? Yeah, it's just one tool, but it's one part of a broader package, right? That it's about recognizing that is about improving the instructional practices. Hence, we need to observe teachers, get lessons, provide lessons about how good he or she is performing, and provide them feedback. However, we see in some systems that sometimes unions oppose at any type of classroom observation, right? It's like saying, no, how can you do that? I mean, teachers are not supposed to be observed, right? Teachers already, they got their preparation, okay, and they are saints and heroes that they have to be in this classroom, and it's disrespectful to observe them and provide them feedback. That is a big mistake, right? That is a big mistake and something that we need to continue discussing with teachers and with the unions. And the final point I want to make is that we talk separately about, yes, I mean, as many will say, we need to see how much we need to motivate teachers. We need to make sure that if we introduce technology is well adapted to the work of teachers. We need to change the way we do teachers' professional development. We need to select teachers in a meritocratic way. We need to promote teachers the right way, promote them not because of tenure, but promote them because they are having a good performance, right? And we need to recognize that. But if you put all those things together, that means that ministries of education should recognize that the HR function, right, the human resource function, is an absolutely essential part of what the ministries of education do, right? So when you go to a ministry of education, you need to think, is there a place, a directorate, right, secretariat, whatever, right, that is really about the human resource function, and this is about how much we pay, how much we motivate, how do we promote, how do we prepare, how do we, support the welfare of teachers, how we support the welfare of their families, and it's the whole package, right? That type of human resource function that has to be integrated and comprehensive, that's something that we don't find in those systems, and it's absolutely essential. But let me stop there because there are many more issues in which we can continue discussing. Thanks, David.
Thanks so much, Jaime. And I think it's true. It takes this whole approach. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to encourage, I want to circle back on a few things. I'm just going to encourage our panelists to try to be very focused because we're going to end right about on time. And so, but there are a few things I want to come back on. So one, I want to come back to Ranjit. So one thing that we heard from Karthik was the value of, especially for teachers who have less sort of, effective preparation, providing some sort of, scripting. And that doesn't mean, like Karthik said, not turning them into robots, but like, giving them some scripts that they can follow to, to get the literacy down and teach other skills. So in your experience, both as a teacher and, you do a lot of professional development for other teachers, like, is this a good strategy, providing sort of these detailed guides and scripts for teachers? Is this the right direction to go?
Yeah, I must appreciate the way Karthik has put that thought and comparing the medical education with the formal education here. And the same thing I apply during my professional development classes. Rather than focusing on theoretical part or giving them examples, it's always good to teach a specific topic. This is how Ranjit is teaching in his classroom. Now, just look at him, how he's planning, how he's engaging in classrooms. So it's like setting an example through our own way of teaching. So it's always benefiting teachers to understand the theory and thought process behind the scene. So it's not about teaching them the methodologies, techniques, and technology. It's always about use and implementation on creating that ecosystem inside the classrooms. I think Karthik has put a really very good point. Rather than focusing on other aspect of teaching and professional development, whether it is the content being implemented in the classrooms or not, or just because so many times teaching professional development courses happen just because to meet the norms after several years. So it's always about just meeting those norms and completing the teacher student profession, maybe completing hours, maybe years, something like this. But it should focus on the real-time preparation as well, and the actual presentation, actual teaching, how Ranjit is teaching, how the world's best teachers are teaching in their classroom. So teaching community gets to know, oh wow, this is what he is doing in his classrooms. So they get to know this is a perfect example. Now then teachers will start thinking whether we can implement it or not. If not, what could be modified during that? So I think that approach Kartik has set up is right way to go to move forward, talking about teaching professional development.
Thank you. I think that's great, and it makes sense to me as well. So one of the questions that we got from the audience had to do with private schools. And Mo, I know you've done a lot of work with private-public partnerships. I'd love for you to come in. You know, people talk a lot about the private sector as being an engine of innovation. I've seen some examples. I think, you know, there are other cases where, anyway, I think sometimes that plays out and sometimes it doesn't. So what do you see, Mo, as coming out of the private sector that we can use like within the pandemic and beyond to scale in our public systems?
Great. I think that a culture of innovation and the ability to respond quickly is a very important one that we can borrow from the private sector. I think that the notion of the public and the private sectors working together is also very important. Within our context in Nigeria, we have seen states establish funds that are privately resourced for low-fee private schools, for example. And this is led by the public sector, driven by the public sector in a public-private partnership, and schools can access these funds to improve on their pedagogy, to improve, to attract and retain teachers, and to maintain their school processes so they don't have to shut down. I think that's quite interesting, because usually for the public and the private schools are at loggerheads. The public sector and the private schools tend to be at loggerheads. So it's interesting that we're beginning to see a measure of collaboration within the country. If I have 1 minute, I'd like to just chip in, maybe 30 seconds, chip into the conversation around teachers. I think one of the points that Jamie was making is one that I wanted perhaps to start with, and just to say that I don't think that there is any significant phenomenon that happens by starting with everyone. I think what tends to happen is that we identify a phenomenon, we agree that it's good practice, and then we begin to understand how we scale that good practice. And, you know, the concept of teachers, I mean, I'm not an advocate of, you know, letting teachers run up and do exactly what they want to do without sufficient guarantees that they can handle it. But at the same time, I'm not a fan of creating the robotic teacher. And the reason for that is simply because education and lifelong learning cannot be separated from the notion of skills for a changing world. The world is changing. And very, very few people can predict accurately where the world is going to be in 20, 30 years. Many of us did not predict the pandemic. We couldn't have predicted the scale of the devastation, even in developed countries. And this is why you need teachers to be learners. You need teachers to be lifelong learners themselves. And that means that you do need to incorporate a measure of the teacher's own agency into their own capacity development. And we've seen very good examples of how this happens in different contexts. And finally, to say that technology, the pandemic has also shown us, if we didn't know before, that you can expand the reach and the audience of a great teacher. And there are many examples across the world in many different countries where technology is helping to take this fantastic teacher and expand his or her audience across thousands of learners. And I think that's definitely something to think about.
I think that's a fabulous point. I'm gonna take us just a couple more minutes, even though we're right at time. I'm gonna go by some earlier time zone, but not for long. I know people have things. But so Yanali, one of the things that we've heard, a couple things here are, one, what Mo was just talking about using technology to expand the reach of a great teacher. And then also this interplay between support and accountability. And you know, you're right there in the South African Department of Education. How do you see this interplay working?
Dave, I think definitely in our context, but I've got a strong suspicion in most other contexts, the word accountability has become a very sensitive word, and people don't know how to make sense of it. And I think that is one thing I learned through an in-person coach being in the classroom, is that often teachers stand in front of a classroom full of children doing their best, and they don't get feedback in the way that we do in this audience by saying, oh, well, great job. I love this paper. I love this research you're doing. And that's often an ego boost that helps you, motivate you to carry on. And I think that's a role that a lot of agents can play in the sector. And I think unions can play a very big role in terms of that. A principal or some leadership in the school can play that role. Other teachers can play that role of visiting another teacher's classroom and saying, listen, I loved how you did this. Like, this is a great way of doing it. And I think that motivation and a little sense of accountability, almost a peer accountability, can take us steps forward in terms of ensuring that teachers do what they do, but also that teachers feel proud in what they do and that they feel valued in a certain way that children can't communicate to them. And so I think that's an important part missing, and that I think coaching in large contexts have started bringing in, is to say, how can the traditional monitor or district official, whoever has been going, that's been saying right and wrong, how can they change their practice slightly to say, I loved how you did this. I can encourage you in doing this. We can think through this area, but that it creates a bit more of a peer accountability space rather than a negative accountability space.
Thank you. I think that's precisely right. Like, there's nothing I found more toxic in my conversations with teachers than the word accountability. And thinking about how to frame this in a way, not just like using tricky words, obviously, but how to frame it in a way that it's like, okay, we want to help everybody sort of do their very best. So Karthik, in the chat, there's been a lot of support and a little bit of pushback on your medical training, on your medical training example, partly because of the quality of health and medical training in many of the same countries that we're talking about, as well as sort of how we think about, with education, the link between how effective a teacher is. Like, often you can't see immediately, certainly, in the same week. So if you can just very briefly speak to those.
Yeah, so I think, there's obviously a ton of differences, and all I was trying to call attention to is a few principles that I think will translate, right? The principles of, I think, and we all agree, right, that we don't want robotic teachers. I don't want to be one, but it's that hybrid, right? That hybrid between, that the doctor goes in with a set of principles from evidence and some ideas of what they're supposed to do when they see a case, and then you kind of diagnose the individual case, and it's the same, so it's that hybrid. And I think, but the other really important piece that I do believe we can and should try to carry over into education is this idea of kind of recertification, right? The fact that you can't spend 35 years in a profession without showing that you continue to stay at a level of knowledge that's required to do the job. And so let me kind of wrap up with a few questions about accountability. And again, I've done a lot of work on different aspects of this. And, politically, my view right now is that the performance-based accountability is going to be much, much, much harder to do at scale because of the measurement challenges. But I do think we can find a middle ground, even with the unions, for competency-based accountability, even if it is not based on outcomes. Because when you try to do this on outcomes, you will get a lot of pushback in terms of saying, teachers can teach, but we can't change the home environment. We can't change a bunch of things. Now, I don't fully agree with that, but let's leave that aside. But I think when you start doing outcome-based accountability, you go down the rabbit hole of measurement and scale and data quality and all of that kind of stuff, right? But I think even if we can just do competency-based accountability, and I think the right way to have the conversation with the unions is, I remember when I was doing my teacher absence work, a union leader once got up in one of my seminars and started yelling at me and saying, you're insulting the entire teaching profession, by talking about teacher absence. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing the insulting. It's the teachers who are absent who are insulting the teachers who are working hard. Okay. So, so you have an internal incentive as a professional community to want to work on high standards, and you shouldn't need the researcher kind of pointing that out. And so if the conversation is reframed in terms of what does high professional standards within a profession look like, and then you bring in this importance of continued education and recertification as a part of that professional ethos, that may have a better chance politically, right? Than trying to do more heavy-handed accountability systems. So let me stop there, and there's, we could talk a lot more about these things.
This is very well said. I think that's spot on. So I'm going to give Jaime a final word. We have talked about so many different things. There are a lot more questions, like we could talk for another hour or so. We've heard about, scaffolding and, different kinds of support and recertifications and technology. So Jaime, I'd love for you, as the sort of thinking about education from the global perspective and talking to a lot of systems, how should systems and partners think about prioritization within all of these amazing sort of innovations that we could do with teacher policy? How should systems think about what to do next on teachers?
Thank you very much, David, for the question. Let me mention 2 points. One first challenge that education systems have is to provide to all teachers, right, with all the tools that they need and all the support, right, that they deserve. We need to make sure that they all receive practical training such that they can improve their performance at the classroom, that we use observation tools so that we can provide them feedback, that we provide them with pedagogical tools, with structured lesson plans, with tools in which they can help them to assess where their students are. Now, the challenge is that all teachers should receive that. That doesn't mean that all teachers need that to the same extent. Some will need that more than others, but then having all those tools at their disposal, they can then be more creative and more innovative and make sure that all their children learn. And the second point I wanted to make is that at the society level, we need to work with countries such that there is a larger supply and a larger demand for learning. Not for schooling, but for learning. And a larger demand, higher demand for learning means that parents should really be worried about their students having a nice and a good experience at the classroom and in the school. They need to be worried about not if their kid is going to school only, but what's happening in that school, that how much they're learning. And on the supply side, we need to have systems that internalize that this is not about putting some inputs and making sure that some activities happen. This is about making sure that all the agents internalize that the reason why they are there is to make sure that all kids learn. That's something that teachers, principals, authorities have to internalize. So I really just want to close, thanking everyone for this fantastic panel in which we have learned a lot, and it's obviously a conversation that has to continue. Over to you, David.
Yeah, this was a fabulous session, and definitely I want to thank our panelists and apologize, obviously, for this kind of disturbing bit at the end, but let's not let that take away. There was an amazing amount of content, and let's put it to work and support teachers and therefore support students around the world. So thank you all very much.
And we'll continue the discussion. Thank you very much, Dave, and thanks to everyone for joining. It was a fantastic panel. Thank you very much.